I would imagine most people who are listening to us are familiar with ICE, but who is ICE? What is their function? Which department are they in our government?
Right. So ICE stands for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And a lot of people don't realize that they've been around for a long time. They started at around 2003 when the administration of George W. Bush was the one that set the stage sort of through something called the Homeland Security Act. So they function actually under the Homeland Department and the Homeland Security Department, and therefore are part of the executive branch.
And describe for me what they do. I mean, presumably, and we should say the Department of Homeland Security was obviously a big piece of legislation that was passed in the wake of 9/11, where and a lot of agencies were rolled together and new agencies were created. I mean, presumably we had some type of border enforcement and some policing internally, I guess, of undocumented immigrants. What did they replace something or simply complement or what?
So what they wanted to do with this, and as you mentioned, this sort of took the focus of immigration as something that, and put it on immigrants as sort of a threat, as sort of under the national security scope. And that's the way that after 9/11, Homeland Security started also seeing immigration under that scope as under the scope of more of a defense rather than, the philosophical view of America, a nation of immigrants. So when ICE was created in 2003, it was already under this scope of treating immigration more as a threat, as a threat to the sovereignty of the country, sort of. And the point of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, it works sort of like a police force without the oversight that police usually gets. So that's what makes a lot of the stories that we can talk about really, really scary, in that they act with a lot of leeway.
Yes, and we should say, I mean, give us a sense of the size of ICE and who. I mean, do you have a sense of who joins ICE? I mean, are these former police officers? Are they people who can't necessarily work as police officers? Are they former military? I mean, who? Give us a sense of who you think these people are typically.
So I actually don't really have statistical information on, your average ICE agent profile, but from what you can see in the way that they are profiled, specifically in right-wing media, they are usually the types that are very strong on the law and order philosophy, sort of. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily and it comes from the top, right? Because it comes from the fact that this administration, the Trump administration, already changed the mission statement that ICE has and turned it into one that doesn't even mention the line that America is a nation of immigrants. So you can see that from their ranks, if that's what's happening at the top, you can imagine that a lot of people within their ranks have this view of immigrants as others, of immigrants as foreign threats to national security. As to what qualifications or they have that make them different from police forces, I cannot really tell you that. But right. in terms of what the view of the entity is, and that comes from the top, and that's what is being reflected by their change of their mission.
I mean, it's interesting because, and I should just clarify, it was, I think we are now in mid-February, mid-March or so. It was late February where the new director of Citizen and Immigration Services announced that they would be changing literally the mission statement and dropping the words "America's promise as a nation of immigrants." And I mean, literally, they've explicitly done this. And I should also say that I've spoken to some people who work with people at ICE, and there is a sense too that the younger people who have come to ICE, right? I mean, because we're probably now in this first generation, or maybe just the second generation of ICE officers who have come to ICE, perhaps, from civilian life. I mean, and probably initial ICE people were coming from other areas of law enforcement. So here we are with ICE. Their function is no different than it was during the Obama administration. However, like you say, starting under John Kelly, who is now the chief of staff, their mission shifted rather radically, didn't it, with Trump's election?
Correct. And you'll remember that under Obama's tenure, there was some implication of prosecutorial discretion. And that's something that makes sense in terms of prioritizing. When you have to deal with right now under the law, it's really difficult to prioritize, and so you have an agency that is spread thin in terms of resources. So it makes sense to have an approach like the one that the Obama administration had towards immigration and how they were dealing with undocumented immigrants, in that those that were literally not a threat and those that were actually not in any way affecting and actually it was a way of better managing resources. So it was prosecutorial discretion in which you could prioritize sort of the deportation of certain types of immigrants, and it said especially those convicted of crimes. That has totally gone out the window under the Trump administration. And it's not only a bad way of managing resources, considering it's literally really, really hard to just go after anyone. It's also dehumanizing, and it's also being taken into authoritarian levels in the way that it's being applied.
Yeah, I mean, this is and it is the case, my understanding, that ICE, starting in 2008, had a very high level, and under the Obama administration, very high level of removals. Where they remove people, and an extremely high number of arrests. But those were people who were convicted previously of a crime. And like you say, that directive has changed. And it has led, in my opinion, and when we're going to take a break in a moment here and come back, and I want to hear some of the stories that you guys have been talking about at Media Matters. And why you argue that ICE agents are terrorizing people across the country, and I agree with that assessment. We have gone from ICE agents who are pursuing arguably dangerous criminals and certainly criminals, maybe 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, in numbers that over the course of the Obama administration shrunk dramatically, to now where ICE agents are basically going for the lowest hanging fruit, people who don't represent a risk to them or to society, mothers, children, easy arrests that don't necessarily make us safer, but like you say, are terrorizing in their nature. We've got to take a quick break. I'll be right back with Cristina Lopez in just a moment. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.